Welcome back to another episode of The Political Life. We come to you from nowhere. We have a regular guest on this week, Chris Massey of Craft Ventures. Chris, good morning.
Good morning.
Great
Thanks
to see
for having
you.
me.
We're happy to have you. And so today we are not doing a typical interview podcast. We are going to pick a few topics and explore those topics or topic with Chris. And then we're also going to have Chris and some of his colleagues back this summer. As a lot of you know, NCSL is back to having a live conference. They are in Denver the first week in August. And so we're going to have at least one podcast with some guests on talking about that conference and what to expect and what different people try to accomplish at attending a conference like NCSL, which is a huge conference. I mean, they'll get more than 5,000 people at that conference. So we're going to have Chris will be coming back on a fairly regular basis to help assist in those interviews and make the format a little bit more interesting. But Chris, for today, I thought you're not based in California, but Craft Ventures, I think, is based in California. You spent a lot of time in California, and you're from California. And so I thought we could explore the recall election in San Francisco, which I did not follow that closely before it happened. But when it happened, I was utterly shocked that the prosecutor there was recalled, that I think it was 60% of the vote to recall him. I
think that was the election night number. I don't know what the number is now.
Okay.
It was a higher number than the number that Chesa Boudin was elected by in 2019. I think when Chesa won in 2019 against Susie Loftus, it was somewhere around 50-49, like it was fairly close.
Mm-hmm.
And the recall election was, at least on election night, was not near that number. I think it's probably pulled back, a little bit. But yeah, it was a fairly stunning but not surprising thing to happen in San Francisco. It's certainly not what a lot of people sort of expected or would have expected, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago when Chesa was first elected. But I think it's definitely looking like the efforts to reform the DA's offices and look at social justice and criminal justice efforts from a more, I'd say, progressive standpoint is not going exactly how the original folks that were elected to do that thought it would. So it wasn't a surprising outcome, but given a lot of the polling going into Election Day, but it was still, somewhat stunning in terms of the fact that it did happen at all, or it could have.
Yeah. And now you're going to have, Democrats are bracing themselves for the midterm elections prior to this, and this just has to make them even more nervous. And clearly they're going to most likely begin to want to move more to the center on some of these policies or in managing this, but it can't bode well for the Democrats for November.
Yeah, we're in silly season. It is in full gear. I don't know that it's going to fully impact sort of the policy priorities of sort of the far left progressive movement in the party. I'm sure it's worrisome for the rank and file Democrat going into November, but there's plenty of time to reset and reshape what a lot of these candidates are focused on. The interesting thing about Chesa is, you see a lot of sort of progressive DAs and prosecutors, being elected, whether it's in, here in Arlington, as well as Loudoun, Virginia. There's one in Durham, North Carolina. George Gascon in Los Angeles, who was previously the DA in San Francisco. There was an aggressive push for that kind of criminal justice reform. And I think there's a lot of support for that itself. But what was interesting is Chesa came in kind of as an outsider, wasn't coming in as a deputy or a prosecutor. And my guess is going from the mindset of public defender to DA is not an easy transition to make. And I'm not sure that it really fit the mold of what was needed in San Francisco. And certainly we found out that that criminal justice reform is hard through this process. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in San Francisco that have, over the last few years, particularly in the pandemic, felt just simply unsafe in San Francisco. And I haven't really, I've been there a lot, but I haven't had that specific feeling. But there are times when you kind of see the city deteriorate a little bit, and you see a lot of broken windows on cars. And there's a video going around Twitter a couple of days ago of a group of people attacking somebody on a scooter. And granted, I don't know the specifics of that, or even if that was actually in San Francisco, so I have to caveat it. But that's sort of the sense that a lot of families in San Francisco were feeling. And frankly, Chesa became the face of it. Fair or not, became the face of it. Probably could have done a lot more to save his role and to show both compassion for those that are unfairly prosecuted, as well as finding a way to make people feel like they should be safe and are safe, but just couldn't like bridge that gap. I mean, I know we've talked about this on previous shows, but my grandfather was a public defender in Southern California and ultimately became a judge. I think that transition is a bit easier because now you are, in the position of a judge within the criminal justice system, but doing it from a place of compassion and understanding. And moving from a public defender to a prosecutor has to be a much more difficult transition. I don't know what it's like personally, but we certainly want our prosecutors to have empathy, but I don't know that we want them to completely throw the book out in terms of prosecuting cases that should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of law. And that's where I think Chesa just got caught up in that. In terms of what I mean, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this too. From in a northeastern community and state, it's completely different than San Francisco. And I'm in sort of a mid-Atlantic area, but from California. What is your thought on how this impacts like the communities in Connecticut or New York or New England?
Well, I think you raised a very good point. I didn't realize that and hadn't thought about the fact that he came from the public defender side and went over to the prosecution side. I think in general, most people are willing to give people a second chance and be generous and look at reforms and not lock people up and not support mass incarceration. But I think what we're experiencing here in the Northeast and in a lot of states is you have, they're not treating 16 and 17-year-olds as adults anymore. And so when they're arrested for, say, stealing a car, they're immediately let go or back out and begin the process of having the system, deal with that. But there were a few cases here in the Northeast where people someone was arrested in the morning and released and was arrested again in the afternoon for stealing a car. And so I think most people are thinking, okay, well, we can't be that generous. I mean, we're not saying they have to be locked up in an adult prison for years. But on the other hand, we can't let 16, 17-year-olds back out over and over again. The system is not dealing with them in a meaningful way because clearly there's something missing with these kids if they're just continuing to do this. And so I think finding that balance is going to be difficult, but I think they can, because I think the answer is not, I think most people think the answer is not just to lock them up, but obviously we can't go the other extreme and just let them go. And so we need those services to fill that gap. And doing that is difficult and it's not inexpensive. And so that's the balance that I think states are going to have to try to meet and try to find the right balance to find those solutions.
Yeah. Chesa was elected prior to the George Floyd incident.
Interesting.
And the defund the police movement. So I don't know that this is the case, but I definitely have a sense that the narrative around it is consistent. Is that you were elected on a criminal justice reform push or a stance of criminal justice reform, and then you have George Floyd and a number of other issues that kind of happen across the zeitgeist, the political zeitgeist. And I think it probably emboldened the Chesa Boudin office to push for even further criminal justice reform in the wake of defund the police, probably kind of grabbing onto that narrative. And that ended up just completely backfiring. I mean, he just couldn't build out what he wanted to build out. Now, in fairness, he didn't have the full his full time in office to do so. And maybe what is missing is he was 30% of the way to getting some real efforts put in place that will change San Francisco. But if you do that to the detriment of people's safety, I don't think you can survive as an elected official. And frankly, maybe you shouldn't. I mean, that's the fairness of a democratic society.
Yeah, I saw an interview. I think it was NBC News interviewed someone, a bike shop owner in San Francisco, and he had a number of break-ins in the store. At one point, I think they tore off the door on his store. And I'll never forget, he mentioned that his car had been broken into 8 times over the past 2 years. And so you take someone like that and he's like, look, I support reforms and I'm open to it, but my car being broken in 8 times, something's wrong. I mean, either we need more police on the street or we need something. But, there's just something. I don't want to live in a neighborhood where 8 times in 2 years, I got to get a window replaced. I got to get whatever they took out of my car replaced. It just makes the quality of life just really aggravating.
I think that's right. And the other piece of it is, for a lot of what we do in representing business interests at a variety of state capitals or the U.S. Capitol or even internationally, you look at regulators, and regulators are sort of tied to a very specific way of doing things. You got laws or you got statute that governs how to regulate an industry or how to regulate, consumer protection or whatever it might be. And yeah, of course, there's some level of empathy and EQ that has to go into that regulatory environment. But we have regulators to read what the statutes are and to implement the reaction to behavior based on those statutes. And trying to change that midstream with no definitive sort of new statutes being implemented or voted on is probably irresponsible. And and DA's offices, they're not regulators, they're law enforcement. So it's a bit different, but we wouldn't have the same expectation of regulators that, we want somebody to come in and just be more interpretive of it. I'm sure there are business interests that would say, I'd like to have less regulation. So I don't want to discount that. So there maybe is some corollary there somehow, but we needed the DA's office to prosecute based on what the law says. And until it says otherwise, maybe not deviate from that. And when it comes to pothole politics and law enforcement, you really count on that. And I think what's going to happen is, between the recall here, the recall for the San Francisco School Board, Glenn Youngkin's victory in Virginia, is moderation is probably going to be the theme of this upcoming election, whether at the local level all the way up to the federal level. The extremes are the loudest, but possibly not emboldened with the same kind of support that they might have had 2 years ago.
And again, to have that happen, in San Francisco is really, I think, what is catching people's attention. I mean, if it was in Oklahoma or Nebraska, they'd be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But, to have it happen there, and I think you're right, it people will regroup and it will, but you're going to have a lot of people looking at it carefully and thinking, okay, where do I go from here? I was thinking as you were talking, we did have an early indication that people are more middle of the road or kind of a moderate response when Eric Adams won the mayorship in New York.
That's right.
A number of much more progressive people he beat. A former New York City captain, I think he was. So that was kind of an early indication, and now it's continuing. But also, I was thinking, the midterm elections, the incumbent party in the White House always has difficult midterm elections. I mean, it's just the way it goes. And maybe this administration has, more or less problems than others. I'm not sure, with inflation the way that it's going and Afghanistan and some other things. But Clinton lost the House, lost Congress for the first time in 40 years when he was president in his midterm elections.
Yeah.
So
Gingrich's contract for
Contract with America. Yeah.
That was a solid move to move people further right, and it worked. And it was right or wrong, it was a changing point for I think election politics across the board. And you've seen like much more of a flip of party control, whether it be at the state legislative level or in Congress. And look at this year. We've had the Russia-Ukraine situation. We have a likely recession and issues with inflation. We're still dealing with the COVID-19 response. You've got a Roe v. Wade decision coming, and the clear indications of what that might look like. And who would have thought that we would have had a second mass shooting in a school the way that it happened? I remember clearly, and I'm sure obviously you do as well, how you felt after Newtown and the Sandy Hook massacre, and now we've got another one. So I think Republicans were sort of marching to a victory a couple of months ago. That still may be the case with the House, maybe not with the Senate, but a lot of these issues that are deep progressive belief systems are starting to come back kind of the way of the Democrats. And if Democrats can manage the middle, I think there's an opportunity for them to retain more seats than they had anticipated. But then you also have the recall of Chesa, which says not so fast.
Yeah, no, that's it's a great reminder why we have elections, because those are some very good points, particularly in blue states. There's a lot of issues coming to a head.
Yeah, and we haven't even mentioned the January 6 hearings. That obviously has been another thing that.
Right. Do you think? I mean, so what do you think about the January 6 hearings? Do you think? What do you think about the impact, and what do you think about, are people paying attention, and what are your thoughts?
I think people are paying attention, but I definitely think it's more on the political and the media side. I think the average American probably has made up their mind on what the January 6th situation was and what it wasn't from their perspective. If anything, former President Trump is definitely resilient in his ability to brush off things that come at him. Every time you think that there's a clear sort of prosecutorial case against the former president, seems to come out of it. So, and I don't know how much of that is media hype versus not, or just a really good approach to fending off any of the threats that come his way. So I think most Americans are their minds are made up about Trump. He's not in office. He definitely wants you to continue to talk about him. That's, we're talking about him right now.
Right.
So, I don't know what ends up happening. If laws were broken, again, going back to the Chesa conversation, if laws were broken, somebody needs to be prosecuted. I don't know who that is in this case. I think I have my opinion, but that's not really that important to this. What I see happening with January 6th hearing, or what I'm hearing here, is the committee is being very precise and intentional with the information that they're presenting, and not necessarily to have a political outcome, but really to show that if someone needs to be prosecuted, enough evidence is there to do it. So, I think that's going to be the goal here. I don't know where it goes, because I don't know what they have cooking for the rest of this thing. But I thought the first few days of testimony were certainly damaging to the president and his staff and his immediate staff, that were clearly attempting to ask the president to help the vice president and to put a stop to this thing. And it didn't happen. And also show maybe the intent of what was the actual outcome of the election, the president's understanding of that outcome, and maybe his refusal to accept it and ability to retain his office. I mean, it's not the first time you've had an elected official defend him or herself aggressively in the face of wrongdoing. So this isn't completely unique. I think you've seen it with a number of speakers of various state houses that where we've seen things like that happen. You've seen it with city council members, even in my hometown of Los Angeles. where people will aggressively defend themselves, and sometimes it comes out to that elected officials benefit, and sometimes it doesn't.
With that, let's wrap it up. And as I said, I think we will be having some very good podcasts coming up on NCSL and some other topics. And we'll definitely have Chris back. For those listening, remember you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You can sign up for our email at politicallife.net. That comes out every week with the show. Well, Chris, it was great seeing you. Great having you on. Is that a Red Sox hat I see?
Oh, no.
What is that?
No.
Oh, UCLA. Okay. All right. That's all right. Great school.
Hey, I got to represent my Bruins.
It looks very much like a Red Sox hat, but go Bruins. Okay. We'll do a shout out for your school.
There you go. You know what? It does look like the Red Sox cap. I'm sure that's by design in some way, but it's always been, as long as I've been a UCLA fan, which has been most of my life, this has been the baseball hat for the Bruins. So I'm not necessarily a Red Sox fan, but great stadium.
But
love going to that park.
Yeah, great ballpark. And go Bruins. All right, Chris, thank you. And to all our listeners, thank you. And we will see you next week.